As a reminder, everyone, this is paid training, so on your timesheet, you can put this down on the training line. Welcome to some of the new faces that we have as we're expanding our PDR group.
What do we call this training, Pam?
Well, the workshop itself is building a budget, building a Goldilocks budget. You can certainly put that in training. You can go on about which of the three little bears you were if you want to add that to your notes. I think you're going to be the one that gets it just right.
All right, I think I'm all squared away. Pam, you can hear me now?
Yep.
I can hear you.
Good.
Beautiful. So you guys are seeing the correct screen?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Okay, well, let's go ahead. So does Pam seem like we have enough people here to go ahead and get started?
Yeah.
All right, beautiful. Welcome, everybody. Okay, so reminder, each of our sessions we've been opening up with sort of our 3 pillars of success, starting with a well-crafted scope and budget as the foundation. And sort of this is where, starting from a good point. And then project tracking and reporting along the way, actively managing the performance and, watching schedule, budget, and so forth, and scope. And then lastly, managing change along the way, because it almost always happens. And then we've talked about the important part is communicating well with your client, and the important part of that important part is doing it when the change happens, not waiting until the end of the project. So those are reminders from every time we get together and do this. Okay, so today we're talking about building a Goldilocks budget, not too big, not too small, just right. And this is the 3rd part of our 3-part series on we won, now we need to get under contract. And before we've talked about work breakdown structures, we've talked about developing a killer scope, and then today we're going to talk about budget. All right, so let's get some interaction and get some people talking. We want to get some feedback from people on any one of these questions. Why did you attend today? What are you hoping to take away from this? And then what challenges are you currently having that you're hoping that you might get some insights from today's conversation? So somebody jump in and help us out from the crowd.
And I'll record these, Scott. I'll make a notes of them.
I think I've been on both sides of the Goldilocks issue. Like we've definitely had a couple scopes in the past where we realized later that we didn't have enough. But then for my Bellevue project, the most recent one, we probably overscoped that. So then the city took back part of the civil section. So it's good to see, yeah, the Goldilocks amount.
One thing I would say, and so on that, Susan, one thing, always be careful that when and you could tell me if I'm wrong, but what I remember from that was that Bellevue didn't say, this is too expensive, we're going to do this in-house. True?
I think they thought that they could save money by doing it in-house. Yeah, when they saw the total price.
Okay.
I think that's what they said, yeah.
And then I just would caution, in those situations, when something like that happens, that unless a client specifically telling you, hey, this is way too expensive and I don't think I can negotiate down with you, so I'm going to do this myself, is that sometimes we end up interpreting what they're doing. And it might be, they may have some staffing changes and they have a project that went on hold and they need to keep some people busy internally. So we tend to end up viewing things and making them about us, especially when it's negative things, because we like to be self-critical. And this is just human nature, but it's just be careful about interpreting a client's actions and what that means if we don't get explicit feedback from them on something. So
okay.
Anybody else? Give me a couple more.
I just want to stay current and hear other people's perspectives.
All right, good one. That's hoping what you're going to take away today. Give me one more.
It's why I attended. So.
Oh, all right. Well, I guessed wrong, but okay, one more.
I have one, Scott. I think one thing, we do a ton of comprehensive plans on the planning side, but I don't think anyone is very proud of a budget that they put together that they know this is the right budget for these types of projects that we keep doing over and over again. So hopefully we learn some tips and tricks
Okay.
for us to hone in.
Okay. All right. Okay, so today we're going to talk about three main things. One is some best practices for building a budget, and then tools and templates that are available to you, with mostly the focus on our labor estimate template, and then some myths. We'll do some myth busting at the end about budgeting. Okay, best practices. I would say like the big thing to start is knowing what your client's expectations are, and this comes from communication. And I would say this is different than, well, I talked to them during the proposal phase, either writing a letter proposal for a sole source. We've asked, hey, I want you to do this work, give me a scope and a budget. Or if even more so when we're competing for work and you've talked to a client before we prepare a statement of qualifications and you know what they're looking for and you have some sense. This is a different conversation, because during that phase of this process, that there's some degree of arm's length to the conversation. So we're in sales mode, they're in buying mode, and so the conversations aren't completely straightforward. There's things that both sides are holding back a little bit. So when you're under contract, or like when you've been awarded and now you're trying to get under contract, and we talked about preparing the scope, is that talked about the importance of having conversation with the client and a kickoff meeting or something, or some dialogue with the client so we're clear what they're looking for. And this feeds into the budget, because one thing that puts us in a really awkward spot is that we have some sense, we think, what the client's looking for, and then we write a budget and we don't really know that they're expecting to spend $100,000, and now all of a sudden we prepared a scope and they say, yeah, the scope looks good, and we give them a budget that goes along with that, and it's $200,000. So if we don't know sort of big picture and then also specifics about what they're looking for, then it's difficult for us to right size the stuff in the beginning. And when I say right size, that you're talking about budget, but like if we're going to move the budget around, what happens to the scope? Especially if I'm going to reduce the budget, what happens to the scope? And I wasn't being rhetorical. I'm actually asking, hopefully somebody's going to answer me.
Might have to
What was
reduce
that
the scope.
answer?
Might have to reduce the scope, and maybe just say you will reduce the scope. So like that's the big thing is that scope and budget go together. If they're looking for us to do something cheaper, then the question is, okay, what scope are we not doing? Or what are we going to change about the scope so that our level of effort to do it is less? And so the knowing what your client expectations are so that we can get in the right zip code and have the correct combination of scope and budget to start with is important, and it helps the conversation and it helps in the negotiations. Because like when we miss the first time, especially if we miss in a way that we've given them some sense of what we're doing scope wise and they're into it, and then we give them the budget and they say, whoa, no. It's like you go buy a car and you think you're going to spend, $30,000, and then you find out you're getting cloth seats and you say, no, I wanted leather seats. It's like, well, no, that doesn't come with this package. And so like you've already mentally decided that you're going to have leather seats, and so it's tough for you to let go of it. But you don't want to spend the extra money. And so the same kind of thing. It's like if you put the client where you say, okay, here's your scope, and then later on, here's your budget, and those two don't line up, that's tough. And so really, really clear with your expectations from the client is important to start with. Does that make sense for everybody? Okay, and then I think like a common thing is like either we do this one of two ways, especially for people who are less experienced in doing it. We either are too low, or there's some people who are really cautious and are too high. Too high we can deal with. The too low is harder. Too high, we'll get feedback from somebody along the way, especially the client, that it's too high, and you could get some feedback from other people and senior colleagues and peers and so forth. But if you're too low, you may not get you won't get pushback from the client, and it may slide through. Like if you were in a hurry and you asked for a peer check and that peer check was in a hurry, then, or both people were less experienced, you're not going to get a safety check from the client about it being too low. So starting too high is easier for us to recover from. So the slide says don't start skinny. So throw in the kitchen sink and then sharpen your pencil. That may be a little bit hyperbolic, but the point is that like start full and conservative, and then you can go from there. Make sure you're including time for managing the project, especially making time for tracking estimate to complete and or earn value. Managing budgets is part of project management, and it can be especially frustrating. Like listening, if like project managers say, "Well, I don't have budget to track budget along the way to figure out whether I'm going to be over or under budget at the end of the job." It's like, well, that's like sort of fundamental to project management. So make sure you include time for yourself to do that along the way. Include time for QA/QC. Include time for administrative support. So if you're going to be leaning on your project accountant or other admin people to help you with some more of the mundane aspects of project management, then make sure you include time for them to do that. We want to capture that time as billable time, and if we don't have budget for it, then that doesn't happen. Don't underestimate time for public meetings or meetings in general. Some things like, let's say, we'll budget for a 1-hour meeting, but we forget stuff like travel time, or we forget stuff like, okay, you spent an hour in the meeting, but then you get put together meeting notes. And so leave some room in there for doing those kind of things so that you don't shortchange yourself. And then lastly, don't worry if it feels big, especially if you're newer to this, that's okay. Like I said, it's easier to start big and then move from there than it is the other way around. Budget seems too high. The big thing is here is don't negotiate with yourself. Anybody know what that means? There was a video we were going to play, but I think Pam, you and I decided this was going to go too long to start with. But there's a really great video that you could Google for YouTube, and it's a scene from 30 Rock with Baldwin, and he's negotiating with his nanny, and his nanny wants a raise, and the nanny is hardball in the conversation, and Alec Baldwin prides himself on being the CEO of this network, and he's getting rolled over by this nanny. But the big message is the nanny does a very good job of laying down what she wants, and then she doesn't say anything else. She just cold stares, and she's peeling an orange and eating the orange like she just cold stares. And he is not comfortable with the silence and starts to negotiate with himself to break the awkward silence. And so that is a very real thing in direct conversations with clients, and we're talking about budget matters. Is there's an adage that one side makes their case, the other side makes their case, the next person who talks loses. So get comfortable with silence, practice it. So if you say that, hey, like this is too high, and you make your case for why you think it's appropriate, and then they don't say anything and they just look at you, move through it. Keep your mouth shut. Be comfortable with the silence. Let them talk next. In that situation right there, the next person who talks loses. Don't lower your fees before you talk to your client. So like, you do this and you think, man, this feels really too high. Or like you do a budget and it comes out $150,000 and you say, well, I know the client only has $100,000. So let me start looking for ways to reduce this. What's flawed with that? I write a scope. I share it with the client. Maybe I haven't shared it with the client. Maybe I just have it myself, but I write a scope. I do a budget. It comes out at 150. I know the client only has 100,000. So I start looking for ways to start reducing some of the hours and try to get closer to 100. What's the flaw there?
It gets emotional, and that's the problem there. We've already identified the scope and the hours, and we start, tweaking down the hours just to reduce the budget, then we're not being truthful with ourselves, and and we're shorting ourselves because the scope's got to change too.
Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else want to add to that?
Project might go over budget anyways.
Sure. Anybody else?
They underestimated it themselves.
We didn't
Yeah,
put together
yeah,
the estimate.
the client could have jacked up the budget to start with, right? Yeah.
I was
Dave?
gonna say it's a good time to approach the client and discuss it with them.
Yeah. So I'm not saying that your first number at 150 is spot on, right? But if you start like, oh, I know the client only has 100, let me see if I can, start reducing some of these hours. Then like what Dan said, like you're coming from a biased perspective now. I would have more faith in your first blush guess or your first blush estimate than now your biased estimate to try to get to where you're pleasing the client. Anybody have any people pleasing tendencies in their personality? So people pleasers are especially susceptible to this. I want to please the client. I know the client's looking for $100,000. What can I do to get to $100,000? Getting to $100,000, great, admirable goal. Let's make it happen. How do we get there? How do we do that? We find ways to reduce the scope. So we can't like just, okay, carve out, $50,000 and call it good. We got to find $50,000 of scope that we're going to do differently or not do.
Hey,
Yes, go ahead, Linda.
one thing I want to add in, I totally agree with you with the sitting still and being silent and that awkwardness. I've seen twice here where somebody sent an email saying, why are you so high? Can you get your price down? And I would recommend thinking similarly. You have to respond. You can't be silent, but the more you write, the more it's like you're trying to justify every little thing, and you just need to put it to succinct bullets of these are the reasons that it's driving the cost maybe from where you thought. And that's been successful for us both times.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I would also say that I would strongly encourage people, if you get that email, then pick up the phone and call the client and have a conversation. Because doing that back and forth, like negotiating via email is not good.
Mm-mm.
So first off, I would pick up the phone and call and do that and negotiation either over the phone or even better in person if you can make it happen. That's harder these days. But then if you do send an email, then yes, keep it very short and straightforward. Yeah, the longer you go, the more likely you are to dig yourself into a hole. You don't get what you don't ask for. Good life lesson in general. It's harder to increase the budget after it's been presented. It's easier to reduce the budget. So the adage like that, you go into negotiation and they say, great, looks good. Where do I sign the contract? And he's like, gee, I wonder like how much money I left on the table. Like, so if they push back a little bit and you end up adjusting some things, then we know that we're in a good spot as far as us and the client are both concerned. If they just say, oh, great, yeah, sign it, then like you always kind of wonder, man, like did I do this too low? So being a little high and then coming down with the client is fine. And like when we're doing that, like you're looking for ways to adjust the scope along with that. If it comes out higher than the client wants, have a conversation. And like we talked about again, same thing is like, what are we adjusting in the scope? And then this is making the point twice. And then just helping people understand what negotiation means, a strategic discussion that resolves an issue in a way that both parties find acceptable. And then leverage. So the concept of leverage, when do we have leverage? Somebody help me out. When are some points along the way in a project delivery when we've got our most leverage and least leverage?
We have the most leverage when we have a clear scope of work.
I would say before we hand over deliverables to the client.
Before we hand over deliverables, it's a good one. Anybody else?
While we're writing a contract.
Before we're under contract. Great. Anybody else? Yeah, I would say like in this context, the time we have maximum leverage is before we sign the contract. Because they want something and we're going to give it to them. And this is when we have the most leverage because they still want something. once they're under contract, then like, well, we're under contract. Then you just take care of it. So other times along the way, like when we start getting into change management and having those kind of conversations, we have most leverage when we're managing change, when we have the conversation in the time that we're doing that, like before we do the work. We have less leverage once we've actually done the work and now we're looking to get paid for it. We have even less leverage when we've done the work and given them deliverables and they already have them. Possession's 9/10 of the law. People know that adage. So that's when we have our least leverage, is that we've done the work, we've given them the deliverables, and now we want more money. So pay attention to when you have leverage and use the leverage when you have it. Budgeting considerations, methodologies, and we'll get to this a little bit later, and like making sure you're using at least a couple different methods. Making sure you're capturing direct expenses. This is a lesser issue today than it was maybe 20 or 10 years ago when we used to do a lot of printing. Our printing costs are way different than when I was much younger. But we still want to make sure that we're capturing direct expenses, especially if we have a lot of travel or that kind of time. Self-consultants, capturing things like permits and fees. So who's paying for these? If we're paying for those, making sure you put it in there. And if the client's paying for that, making sure that's clear in the scope. Contingency, sort of building in change management stuff, and like whether you got some reserve or how you're doing things like that. And then we talked before in the scope discussion about assumptions and exclusions and so forth. Like what is the budget and what happens with it? Well, it becomes part of the contract. I would say as far as the budget information that we're presenting to the client to attach to the contract, back to what Lynette just said, that less is better. So I would say that the information that we give to the client to attach to the contract is the least amount of detail that they're comfortable with is what I would recommend we put in the contract. So if the client is okay with the contract saying that I'm going to pay you $50,000, then leave it at that. If they want to say, I want to see what your breakdown is for your 6 phases that roll up to $50,000, then give them the budget for the 6 phases. If they say, I want to see the phases and the tasks and what employees you have and how many hours they're working and how much each one of those billing rates are, then that's kind of the full Monty of detail. And if the client wants it, then we're going to give it to them. But whatever level of detail, the least level of detail the client's comfortable with is what I recommend that you put into the contract. Different contract types quickly. One of the more common ones is hourly rate, also known as time and materials. This could be our standard contract. It could be a client's contract. And when you look at like our default hourly rates off the intranet, the billing rate table, that's what that's based upon. And we're billing out categories of people in a given range. And each employee that at SCJ belongs to a labor category, and they have an hourly rate, billing rate associated with them, and that's what shows up on the invoices. And that would be what was called like a fully burdened rate, which means it includes both includes 3 pieces. It includes direct salary, overhead, and fee, sort of all rolled up into one rate. So, for instance, we may be billing out like a P2 at say $150 an hour, and I'm kind of making up numbers, but so it's not broken down into different pieces, like it's just one rate for every hour that they work that gets billed out $150. We've talked before about sort of that rule of thumb of multiplier of 3. So that person probably is making in the neighborhood of like $48, $50 an hour in terms of their direct salary. Second type would be a lump sum contract, more common in civil, planning sometimes, and some of the other business groups. This says that we're going to do this scope of work for you, and you're going to pay us $50,000. And if we end up spending $35,000 to do the work, then we made $15,000 extra in fee on that project. But as opposed to hourly rate that we're getting paid for every hour you work, lump sum is that we're getting paid to produce the products that are in the scope, and then we get paid that amount. And then if we go over, then it took us more money to deliver those products, then that's bad, and that's a write-off. That's lump sum contract. We talked last time in the scope conversation about the importance of being clear and detailed in a scope, especially important in a lump sum contract. Because now you are saying, I'm going to do this work and I'm going to do it for this price. Any ambiguity, that we're going to own the ambiguity. So like the gray areas and says, well, like we had to do this and we didn't know we're going to have to do this. And when those are gray areas, that's a much more difficult change management conversation than maybe a T&M contract. The lag or WashDOT contracts are when we're contracting directly with DOT, or if we're working on federal aid projects or state funded projects that are going through WashDOT local programs. There's 3 brands of those contracts. One is called negotiated hourly rate. One's called lump sum, and one's called cost plus fixed fee. Negotiated hourly rate is basically same thing as T&M, except the billing rates are built with 3 components. And I think I'll go into this a little bit later. And then the lump sum is same as like we would do any other lump sum. And we would build our backup for that budget based upon just our default hourly rates. And then the last one is cost plus fixed fee. And my advice is don't ever do a cost plus fixed fee contract. The term cost plus, and this is a little bit specific to transportation, sometimes planning. But just to go down the rabbit hole for a second, the term cost plus fixed fee is what I would call, like, you think about like the terms Kleenex and tissue, and people think about Kleenex as a generic term, but Kleenex is a brand. Tissue is the generic term. People think about cost plus fixed fee the same way. They think it's like a generic term for time and materials, and it's not. It has some very specific characteristics to it that we find undesirable, and most all local agency clients also find undesirable. They just don't know what those characteristics are. They're not aware of them. So lots of times we'll be asked to do a cost plus fixed fee contract because they're using the term Kleenex instead of tissue, and they don't really want a cost plus fixed fee contract. So if you get in that situation, call me and we'll work through it. There are rare exceptions when they draw a red line in the sand and say you have to, but most of the time we don't ever want to do these. Okay, let me pause there for a second. Any questions so far? Tools that we have out on the, yes, go ahead.
On one of the earlier slides, you were talking about only including as little detail as the client will accept. And then on this last one for the lump sum, you were talking about avoiding any ambiguity. Can you kind of talk about, I guess, the difference between those 2 guidelines?
Perfect. Thank you for that question. So when I say less detail, I mean less detail as far as the budget's concerned, like less breakdown of the budget into its individual tasks or subtasks or phases or so forth. I definitely don't mean less detail in the scope. I want you to have a very clear and detailed scope, but then you price that scope, and you go through the exercise of having a labor estimate template, and you figure out who's going to work on it, how many hours, and you've got that spread across phases, tasks, and subtasks, and you've got all that background detail. And when you run all that math, it rolls up to a number of $50,000, or say better, that it rolls up to a number of 46,314 cents. And you decide, okay, I'm going to round that up to $50,000, and you propose to do the work for $50,000. And the client says, great, $50,000. Then what I'm suggesting is that the contract says that you shall do the scope that's attached to this as Exhibit A, and I'm going to compensate you $50,000, end of story.
Okay, so less detail about the financial breakdown, but
Correct.
the scope fully detailed.
Correct, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? Great question. Okay, tools on the intranet. So let's pause for a second. This is the interactive portion of the show. What tools are you all using today? How are people building their budgets today?
Fee estimator.
The labor estimate template, is that the same
Yes.
thing? Okay,
Yep.
all right. Anybody else?
Prior
Anybody uses something besides the labor estimate template at times?
In addition to the labor template, using a percentage of the budget for the project, if we know what the construction budget is, to see what our fee template, like trying to look at that after the fact and see how they line up.
Okay. Anybody else?
I
know some people don't use labor estimate template, so speak up, people. Be bold.
I use the fee estimate, but I compare it to old projects that were similar tasks.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I'll look at similar projects for residential, right? We're looking at similar amenities and things that people wanted, similar sizes of the site, and then kind of comparing how much it costs to actually complete that project.
Okay. All right.
I'll do a quick check on a spreadsheet, a very, very simple spreadsheet to estimate how I imagine the scope is going to conform to what is often a fixed fee budget for a grant.
Okay.
And then I'll use that as a basis to then enter into the fee estimate template.
Okay, cool. Good stuff. And then I can't remember, Pam. So like I know there's a portion of this that talks about using at least two different methodologies. Is that
Yep.
later on? Okay,
That's
good,
coming.
good.
Yep.
Those are good things, and I'm going to come back to all those points, and we're going to expand on that stuff. So good stuff. So budgeting tools on the intranet. So under project management, under resources, under project management is where you would find stuff. And let me see if I can do a magic pointer. So under resources is you go to project management, and then under project management, you would go to budgeting. And then in the root of budgeting, there are 3 different tools that are in here. This first one is specific to that WashDOT lag contracts we talked about. If you want to know more about this, then call me and I'll explain it. This is some guidance, like, you know, if you were going to, I want to include admin time for my project accountant or other admin staff to help me out. I really don't know how to go about doing that. You could look at this and get some guidance from that. And then if you were interested in figuring out, okay, how much actual profit is my project going to get if it goes according to plan based upon the billing rates and the people that I'm using, that you could use this to figure that out if you were the curious type. And then the main one is dropping down from the budgeting to the 2 sub headers in here, and the hourly rate T&M or lump sum, and then lag and WashDOT. So under the hourly rate and lump sum is the labor estimate template, and then also our standard billing rate table. And like you pull this up and it says, like, you know, project manager makes between X and Y. And so these are the 2 main things there. And then the labor estimate template, if you go under lag and WashDOT contracts, there's also a tool for labor estimate template. These are the exact same file. There's not a different Excel file for hourly rate versus WashDOT and lag. It's the exact same Excel file. In way back many years ago at SEJ, they were actually different, but we merged them together somewhere along the way in the past, and we just left them is in both spots on the intranet. So just know that whatever one you pick, it's the same thing. This is what our rate schedule looks like. You can see the different labor categories, and it ranges in here. You know, if you looked up a specific person, it was an E3, that you would be able to find what their actual billing rate was for that person, and it would range somewhere between 130 and 185. And then the other way you can get to some of this stuff sometimes, if you don't go through resources project management, you can always look in this keyword search under resources to find things. Differences between hourly rate, aka time and material, and the wash.lag is the big difference is hourly rate. We talked about that it's like one rolled up rate per person, and that rolled up rate includes direct salary, overhead, and a fee. Negotiated hourly rate, that the government wants us to break that down into 3 component parts. The first component is direct salary. The next component is overhead. And because they're the government, they have to have fancy words. They call overhead indirect cost rate. So sometimes you'll see the term ICR rate or ICR letter, which is a letter we get from DOT telling us what our approved overhead rate is for the coming year. And then fee. And then the fee in these contract types is calculated as a percentage of direct salary. And so a typical range for us on a fee would be anywhere from, say, like 28 to 32%. And that's as a percent of direct salary, which roughly works out to in the ballpark of like 10% of the total. And then Pam has a note in here that you can open up that labor testament if you want from the internet and follow along as we're looking at some stuff. So we'll do pause. And so Dan Ireland, can you sing some elevator music for us for 15 seconds while we
Do 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 do
give people a
do.
chance to open up the labor estimate template?
Scott, maybe you should show them where they can find it.
You can find this under under resources, project management, and then down here under budgeting, the same, like we said, it shows up in both spots, either hourly rate or lag wash dot, and click that guy, view and follow the steps, open up, download template. The really exciting news for those of you who've used this for a while is that it's frustrating because it has macros, and Microsoft was trying to protect us from the evils of viruses, and so you'd have to save this and then open it back up and like enable the macros, and you had to go through some extra steps, which was frustrating sometimes. The great news is that round of applause for IT that they've fixed this, so we no longer have to go through the extra steps, and you can open this and enable the macros and save as and be on your way and avoid a couple steps. So thank you very much. That's always been frustrating in the past. When you first open it up, one of the quirks of the email or the template is this always says subconsultant billing rate schedule up at the top. But as soon as you pick a contract type, this is going to change to, say, consultant billing rate because we're the prime. And so here are the different things that you can pick in terms of the first thing you do, come in here, and the first tab is called billing rate table, and you pick the kind of contract you want. So anytime we're doing T&M for either our contract or a client's contract, that we would pick this SCJ standard contract type. Then we've got lag in here. We've talked about DOT. We've talked about SDOT is for Seattle. This is sort of rare, and I wouldn't worry about it. If you need to use this, see me. And then the reason for the custom lag and the custom wash dot is that every year our overhead rate changes, and we put that new overhead rate directly into this template. Every once in a while, we have to do an amendment where we need to use an old overhead rate. Rare, but it happens. When that does happen, then you pick one of these custom types, and you're able to type in directly what our overhead rate is. After you go from the billing rate table, the next one we're going to go to is the hours estimate table or tab, sorry. And this is what this looks like. It comes in default with 3 phases. It comes in, with 3 phases, and then under each phase, there's 3 tasks. And then under each task, there's 5 subtasks, and that's just the default way it opens up. Then you can open up from the hours estimate menu, and this is how you can add phases or remove them, add tasks or remove them, add subtasks or remove them. The intent here is to to automatically insert or delete rows, because inserting and deleting rows is one of the easiest ways to break formulas that are sums or subtotals of like formulas. Those get broken very easily when we insert or delete rows, and so doing it through the macro will ensure that they don't get broken. So one tip that I have for you is the very first thing to do that I like to do is I have a scope. I have a work breakdown structure in that scope. So I know how many phases I have. I know how many tasks there are under each phase, and I know how many subtasks there are under all the different tasks. So I will go through and I will use these buttons right here to start, say that I've got, it comes in default with 3 phases. I know I've got 7 phases on the project. So I'll go to a phase line and I'll click this button 4 times. So now I've got 7 phases. Then I'll go to phase 1 and I know I've got 2 tasks on phase 1. So I'll go to one of the tasks under here and I'll delete 1 task. So now I've got 2. I go to phase 2, do the same thing. So build the correct number of rows that you need for phase, task, and subtask that matches up with your work breakdown structure, and then start typing in all the names. And the reason I say this is because otherwise, the way that the macros work is that it doesn't allow you to put things at the bottom. And so a classic thing to happen is like you start and you get to the bottom of things that are available to you, and now you need a new one, and it'll insert it in there, but it inserts it like one above the bottom. And then you have to move stuff around to adjust for that, and that can get frustrating. The fastest way to do this is to just set them up, how many phases, how many tasks, how many subtasks you need at the very beginning, and then start typing in the words. So first, use the menu to add, remove phase, tasks, subtasks. Then come over to the column for how many how many employees you want, and if you know how many employees you want, is fix that next, and that happens right here. And then you can go in and put all the information in. The little hint is you're using this labor estimate template. If you do need to do something to turn off the protections are in there so that we don't bust formulas on accident. If you do need to turn off the protections because you need to change some formatting or do something quirky, then the password is just lowercase scj. At the bottom of the hours estimate tab, there is one of these right here, these macros. If you want to see a summary of what the costs are including the total of the labor will show up over here. And then if you want to see the expenses and the subs and all of that shows up on the hours estimate tab, then you use this toggle to turn on direct total cost toggle. So this will turn them off or turn them on. We recently added all the estimate to complete stuff. That's the columns over here that you can use this to help you feed information into Vantage project planning. If you want to toggle that off or on, you could do that here. Then my one caution is the stuff down here. We know that this is a current bug and Ryan and I are working on fixing it. If on your fee determination tab, that this is where expenses show up, and these are the expense options that show up as a default, copy, printing, all the kind of miscellaneous stuff, and then mileage. If you have other expenses on top of this, then you use a macro in this menu to add expenses. When you do that, this number down here gets jacked up. That's not working correctly right now. So no, in the rare circumstance, when you do turn this on and you do add expenses, that this is broken, if that happens, call me and we'll fix it. We just have to fix a formula directly. Most of the time, I personally don't turn this on down here. So from this macro, I will toggle that off, and this won't show up. It'll stop right on that line there and just show all of the hours and all the money for just labor. And then I put the whole thing in terms of the bottom line that's showing labor, expenses, and subs on this page. Some people don't like providing this page and they want to provide just this stuff to the client and they turn this on. Great, do that, but know that if you do that and you add an expense, that this stuff down here is currently going to be broken, and call me and I'll fix it. And then Ryan and I are going to get that fixed so that doesn't happen in the future. Dan Ireland.
I'd prefer the fee determination tab being what it is, and then on the other tab, roll up the page, the printable area, to not include that bottom part to avoid that conflict. Like it's still there, but it won't print. So pull the page break up right above
you're
the
saying
indirect
you like
costs.
you say you like to see this, but you just grab the print area and drag it up here so it doesn't print.
Yep. So that way we don't have that conflicting information and we don't need to duplicate it because it's duplicating a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But just don't make it a default printing area.
Yeah. Yeah. You could do that, or you could like just toggle it off and then print it. Same thing. So, okay, great. Thank you for that. Did I want to say anything else on here? I think no. This tab, the fee determination tab, is where you put in people's rates here. So depending on what you picked, if you pick like T&M, then you'd put the $150 an hour in here. So you had an E3 that you'd put in $150 an hour here. If you pick the washout or lag, then you're putting somebody's direct salary rate in here. This says fully burdened rate. If you picked the washed out or lag type, then over here it shows you what contract type you've picked. So if you pick the washed out or lag contract type, it would show that here, and then this label would change to direct salary rate, and you'd put in people's direct salaries. Everybody who is a PM and above in Vantage can see for each employee what their direct salary rate is and what their fully burdened rate is. If you don't have those access rights in Vantage, talk to a PM that can get those for you, or talk to your project accountant and they will pull those for you. This is also where you add subs and expenses. Use this macro button to pull up the menu, and then this is where you add or subtract them, If you don't have your cursor sort of in the neighborhood of the subs and expenses when you do this, it'll give you a message and say move your cursor. So do that. And then down here, the sub-consultant integration, some cool stuff, but I would say if you're going to use this, then call me and let's talk through it, because this gets a little complicated and it gets nuanced. Know that exists. Basically what this does is like you could create different tabs in here for the sub-consultants, and then export them so you can send it off in an email and they can put stuff in there and put it back in, and it's cool, but it gets complicated, and there's things that get broken along the way. So if you're interested in this, just call me and we'll work through it separately. Otherwise, you add sub-consultants and they show up in here, and then you're just you put their names in here, and then you just put the dollar amount directly in here. Hit the button and then add the number of subs you want to add, so you can do it all in one shot. And then when you pick the contract type, and then you've got the labor classification that is showing up when you do this, like you're filling in the labor classification here, the category. If you do that and you come up with a combination that's not working, it'll tell you that $160 is out of range for an E1. And so it gives you a heads up, hey, sorry, that doesn't fit. And so you can go back and figure out what's wrong and fix that. And then if you want to remove these unused rows, well, I don't want like that red text showing up. This looks like something's wrong. That's coming from leaving an employee column here. And so like I talked about, you can use this hours estimate menu to delete an employee. Tip, it always wants to delete one that's not the last one. So if you're not sure how many you're going to need, don't leave the last one blank, leave the next to last one blank. Because if you try to delete the last one, it says, sorry, Charlie. And then you put a whole bunch of hours in here, and now you have to go copy them and move them over one to make it work. So tip, don't leave the last one blank, leave the one before that blank. And then when you're all done, if you need to delete that last one, delete that last one. If you need to add, you can add. But if you leave this one blank, and then you try to delete it at the end, it's going to say nope, and then you have to move all this person's hours over here to delete it.
Scott, my favorite tip is on that one is make the last one your project accountant. So it's already occupied and you always have to have it. So always make the last one the project accountant.
Perfect. Good tip. Let's see, where was I? Okay, and then there's a couple other tabs in here. One's called the task summary. And you just press this button and it goes, and then there's some green or red flags that says whether it worked correctly, and then making sure that the numbers are matching up between your fee determination tab and this breakdown. And so this is just a breakdown that shows all the phases and the tasks that we have, and it goes to each one of them. I know sometimes that people don't like giving these two products, this backup and then this page, to a client. It's maybe like on a letter proposal or a lump sum, and you're looking for something that's just summarizing what the dollar amounts are broken down by phase and task. Great, use this tab. It creates the numbers for you. There's also a version that does this at the phase level. And so this is just phases as opposed to showing phase and task. Same thing, hit the button, it goes and creates the breakdown for you. The one caution I would say is that on WashDOT and lag contracts, this is currently broken. Also known issue. Ryan and I are working on fixing this. This one I don't have a workaround for you right now, but like there was some stuff that happened when we created the ETC functionality that the macros that are running right now are off by a few columns, so the numbers are all kind of jacked up. So this one still works. So you can run the task summary on a WashDOT lag, but this one currently is broken specifically for WashDOT lag. So the main point I'm making here too is like that for people that don't want to provide that hour breakdown and the fee determination tab, and they're looking for more something like a summary table to give to the client and this would be the budget backup that goes in the contract. We talked about putting in the lease information that the client's comfortable with. Elise did a great job clarifying that doesn't mean less detail in the scope. Full detail in the scope, maybe less detail in the budget. So this would be like a roll up, and I'm just going to show the client that here's our budget amounts by phase for this work, and they're going to throw this at the back of the contract, and this is going to be our budget example. So these tools exist if you want to just show the summary stuff and you don't want to show all the people and all the hours, then you can do this.
Scott,
yes.
Can I add something on that last slide? Based on some feedback from our killer scope training, the template will, we're working on getting it adjusted. So there is, for people that include this information in a scope and fee letter, to be able to just take this and place this in the template. And then people that don't need that section can just delete it.
Okay, cool. So that's an improvement that's coming.
Currently, like for especially on the civil side or private jobs or things like that, I just straight copy and paste this from labor estimate into my scope of work. So just flat out copy paste this thing. You do have to unlock it to be able to achieve it. But the last thing I want to do is hand enter from one thing to the other and risk a fat thumbing or it not summing up. And I also get rid of the cents because it makes the numbers look better. I get rid of the pennies. So I just round it to the whole dollar or $500 and don't make the numbers look bigger than they need to.
Cool. And when Dan says unlock it, that's what he's talking about, is using his password and then just lowercase SEJ. So then he's taking the password protections off, and then you can come in and format these numbers. You just come in like normal in Excel. You just say, okay, I want to format these numbers to be 0 decimals instead of showing the 2 decimals that are in here now. You could even change these formulas to round the numbers if you wanted to. There's also a round up formula you could use if you want to round them all up. So turn off the protections, and then you could tweak this if you want. And these are hard coded numbers that the macro is hard coding. This is not using a formula that's linked back to your hours estimate tab or the fee determination tab. When you run the macro, it's hard coding these in here. And these numbers up here, green and green, is saying all's good. These numbers are matching your hours tab and your fee determination tab. If you ran this macro and then you went back and you're negotiating with the client, and so you've changed some of the scope, you're going to change the budget, you change the numbers, you come back over here and this will show up with red numbers and saying these don't match. And then, okay, well, that's a flag to run the macro again. the reason I bring this up is one, to pay attention to the green versus red numbers, and also to know that if you do change these numbers in here and you went through and you changed these to like roundup formulas, that's fine. You're not breaking something elsewhere in the spreadsheet, that these numbers are just hard coded and specific just to this tab. Also, that was just kind of a quick primer. If you have questions, call me. I'd be happy to help you out. There are 2 different videos on the intranet that you can go watch. Brad Shea, who is the original developer of this Excel workbook, give training classes of brown bags on how to use it. So those 2 are out there in this location. And then Pam and I have talked about doing a version of this and doing a deeper dive on just the labor estimate template and using it later on. So keep an eye out for that. And then ask around. Everybody, every office, every business group has people who know how to use this very well. Dan's thrown out some good examples of some best practices he's followed. So find somebody that knows how to use it well, and then use them as to help you along. And don't hesitate to call me if you got a question, and I'll help you out. Okay. Lump sum contracts, switching gears a little bit off the labor estimate template now. That we talked before about, this is a fixed price for the work that's defined in the scope. And why do we do these? Well, one, it gives us a chance that if we're efficient and we're effective and we do our work well, then we can get more, we can make more money, which is a nice incentive. We bill the client by the percent complete, not by how many hours we've worked. So say that we have that $50,000 fee we talked about, and we decide that we're 10% done with the work, then we bill the client $5,000. Now we may have worked hours, and you do the math on who did the work and how much they cost per hour, and that turned out to be $4,700, but we think we're 10% done, so then we bill $5,000. So we don't bill by the hours, we bill by the percent complete. Typically, that percent complete happens on a phase level. You could do it at a project level. You could do it at a task level. That's up to you and the client and how you negotiate the contract to start. I would say normally it's at the phase level. When you do these kind of contracts, still create a work breakdown structure. You need that for the scope, and then use that work breakdown structure and build a budget, and build that budget using the T&M, the standard billing rates. So that's the SEJ standard contract is the one you click in that labor estimate template, so that we have budget backup as to where you came up with your total number. And then don't be afraid when you get to that number to round stuff up to present your fee. So Dan talked about taking the cents out, and it is it's more odd to have very specific numbers in a lump sum contract than it is to have round numbers in a lump sum contract. So not only is the client expecting it to be a round number, but it gives us a chance to round up a little bit, and then just add that little more cushion to the number. It's typical in like a scoping letter to include this as a table at the bottom. This is like in civil, sometimes some other groups. And then to emphasize again, it's important to build a spreadsheet with that backup using our labor estimate template, so we know where the number came from. We don't want, especially like think about that somebody starts a project, you're a PM, and then that person for whatever reason has left the company, and we say, hey, can you take over this project? And you say, okay, I'll take over this project. And you look at the contract, and there's a contract for $50,000. And you're thinking, man, how are we going to do this work for $50,000? I don't know how this is going to happen. And you've got no backup to go to. Where did that $50,000 number come from, right? So always do backup. This is what it might look like as an example in a letter proposal, that we have a summary at the bottom. You can see this looks similar to what we talked about on that phase summary from the labor estimate template. Okay, how do you estimate hours? I'm going to get back to I had asked before about different tools that people were using, and I was kind of looking for people to talk about like the different types of Excel files that are templates they might be using, but there was some good feedback about more what I would call sort of estimating methodologies, and so that's what we're going to get into now. And then what I would say starting out is that define how many hours it's going to take you to do the scope that you've written up. Then decide what the budget and the fee is that you're going to use. This would be, and this is kind of just my own personal opinion, this would be a version of what's called bottom-up budgeting. The main point I want to make is that I want you to at least use two different ways of doing it. And so the bottom up is what we just talked about, is that how many hours is it going to take you to do the work? Who's going to do that work? And how much is the billing rate for those different people? And you roll all that up and it comes to a number at the bottom. The bottom up means bottom of the work breakdown structure. So like the subtask level, the lowest level where we're writing what in the scope, that's the level where we write what we're actually doing, as opposed to being a header. And then that's the level of the work breakdown structure where we estimate hours for somebody to do that work. So bottom up would start with that, and we roll that all up to a number, a top line number. Top down would be something like that. Patrick had a version of this and Bill Grimes had a version of this. So Patrick said % of construction and engineering projects, especially for final design and plan specimen estimate, PS&E. It's not unusual for people to use rules of thumb that says, okay, that engineering can be 20% of the cost of construction. So somebody's figured out that this project's going to be $2 million in construction. So if I take 20% of that, then the engineering shouldn't be more than $400,000. That would be a version of top down. Bill Grimes said that he likes to have maybe a separate spreadsheet and starting out, and he's got some sense because he's been doing this for a long time that, okay, I have a community engagement piece, and then I've got this other piece of my scope. I've got this other piece of my scope. I'm going to say 15 grand for that, 20 grand for that, 5 grand for that. And that's another version of top down. Usually the top downs are, I said, based upon rule of thumb and like % of construction we just talked about in Patrick's case. Or rules of thumb might be that you've been doing this for a while and that you just kind of have a sense for what you think it's going to be, right? Another way would be doing unit pricing. This could be like a cost per sheet. Say that we're doing an engineering project and we know that when we do the PS&E package that we're going to have 50 plan sheets, and that we could keep track, over the course of several projects. So generally speaking, how much does it cost us per sheet to do the engineering? You could do this like per report or per public meeting or some other unit pricing. So the point is that if you start like with the top and like do something like Bill Grimes had described, or you take a percentage of construction and you start there, that you do want to also do the sprinkling hours across the whole thing and compare those two. Or vice versa, like you start with sprinkling hours across your scope and see where that comes out, and then sanity check it with the top-down method. Personally, I'm a fan of doing the bottom-up first, is putting in hours for what it's going to take to do the scope, and then doing a sanity check with a top-down version, either a top-down version or a unit pricing version if this fits. So some people do it the other way around. I would argue that when you do top down first, you've created that bias that we talked about earlier, where the people pleasing, that a client wants to do it for $100,000. And so then you find a way to fit $100,000, even though if you did the bottom up way first, you might come up with a bigger number. So I think this one, starting with this and then saying, okay, I've got $100,000. How am I going to spread $100,000 across these different phases and tasks and subtasks, leads to potentially more bias that you're not really being honest with yourself about how it's going to take to do the work. But in the end, what I'm really asking is that you at least do it two different ways, and so that you have some sanity check with the number that you came up with.
Hey, Scott.
Yes.
This is Jean.
I recognize
So when you're
you.
talking about
Yes.
top down and bottom up, I know I always tended to start with an idea of what I thought it was going to take, and then put my time onto the estimate sheet. And I always surprised myself in early days, especially of my career, that my budget came out higher than what I estimated when I sat down and thought this is going to be 125,000 or whatever. And then my budget turned out to be 160,000 or something. Like, whoa. So I started doing what you're talking about in terms of top down and bottom up. And eventually what I found is that if you use both methods and you're tweaking hours by task, and you get to a point where it doesn't matter if you add a few more hours here or take them away there, it keeps coming up, you know, at $160,000. It's probably because it's $160,000, right? That your early estimate was off. And so
Yes.
there's this whole, I always found that as I tried to finesse, if I couldn't get it if the finessing wasn't making much of a change, I was probably in the right ballpark.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that dynamic that you're describing is, I certainly resonates for me, and it's very similar to things that I've experienced. The when you start with bottom up and you start by filling in hours, or even if you, like what Gene's talking about, like you have a sense in your head, this is a $125,000 job, and then you go through and you put in all the hours, that when you're figuring out how many hours it's going to take to do at like the subtask level, people generally fall into two categories. Either they tend to overestimate how much each of those things take, or they underestimate. It's rare that people kind of get it right. They either are careful, or they're aggressive. They don't tend to be like spot on, and which is why the big reason why I want to do it at least a couple different ways. And so the people who are careful is that if you have a little bit of cushion in every subtask and every employee that's working on that subtask, and so say at the end you've got 40 subtasks, which wouldn't be, that's not a huge number, and you've got 5 employees, that's 200 different individual hour entries that you're making. And if you have a little bit of cushion in each one of those 200 individual entries of hours, that adds up. And so that's the reason that we're doing at least 2 different methods, and say, okay, let me sanity check myself. Does this make sense? And again, like when I talked about don't negotiate against yourself and start like just slashing budget, that's not what Gene's describing in terms of finding 2 different methods and sanity checking and getting those 2 methods to sort of come together. That's just doing the budget. What I'm talking about is like once you've done that and you feel good about what you've created, then don't negotiate against yourself. But like if you're doing what Gene's describing and you have a sense that this is how much it's going to cost, and you do the hours and that's out of line, then go back and look at that. Okay, is it really going to take me this many hours to do this subtask? And maybe I'm being a little bit cautious here, that if things aren't going to go wrong for all the subtasks, some things are going to go wrong, but it's not going to go wrong for everything. And so so go through that exercise. And that's the whole point of doing it 2 different ways, is that you zero in on the right number. And then also, get especially when you're less experienced in doing this, get a peer to check it. And then also get somebody who's close to doing the work, that actually is going to do the work, to do it. And because like I talked about, like the older you get and the further you get removed from doing the work, the less sense you have for how long it takes to do things. So like way back in the dinosaur era, when I used to do CAD work, that how long I think it took me to do things in CAD and how long it takes to do things today are very different. And so like, I'm not very good at estimating that stuff anymore. And like I just went through this exercise just yesterday with Matt on a project for Port Townsend. And, I filled out, I prepared a scope and I gave it to him, and then asked him to estimate hours. And kudos to Matt, because he actually paid attention to what was in the grant amount in terms of dollars that were available for engineering. And he said that my number's lower than what's in there. And I said, that's okay. I said, I will never go lower than you give me without talking to you, but sometimes I go higher than what you give me just because I think it's appropriate. The other thing he did that I'll point out that was very helpful was he said, I didn't put any hours in for these 3 subtasks because I didn't know, I wasn't clear like what it was or how to estimate this. And I talked before in the scope conversation, the scope training that we did last time was that if you give it to somebody else, could they price it? And so that's like he found like 3 spots in the scope where I wrote a subtask and said, we're doing this. And then there wasn't enough information in there for him to independently decide how many hours that would take. So that's a great catch for me is, oh, I need to go back and clarify those things in the scope and make it more clear so somebody else could estimate those. So do all those things, put that stuff in the sausage maker and then come to a number. And then that's the number we're talking about. Don't negotiate it yourself.
Yeah, I also think don't bring your wild optimism that everything's going to go perfectly as you're doing your scope.
The other end of the spectrum is the people who tend to be that think that everything's going to go right, and it doesn't. We have hiccups on every project, and we also have learning. Like people are learning on every project.
And that's not unique to SCJ, right?
No,
that's something that happens
across the like our industry is heavily reliant on the job learning. So that's normal, and everybody knows it's normal, and so it's built into the cake or baked into the cake, so to speak. And so leave that in your budget. So people on your projects are going to be learning, and so there's like don't unicorn budget like the for.
Hey Scott, also the client's learning too. A lot of times they've never done this before, and so how would you kind of anticipate that portion of it where either the client's learning because they've never done this task before, or they're going to throw new people on it, or they have turnover on their side?
Yeah, I would say like back to my, like the harder a conversation gets, the more straightforward you need to be. So be straightforward and stop talking.
And I kind of sparked a thing. I think if we see more and more proposals and things like that, where they are asking for commitments for our team structure, maybe in our scope works, we should ask the same thing back. Like, this will be the PM. Like, PMs won't change or things like that. For this, we should take a hit when they change and they change the arrangement. So we should probably flip that back and put that in our understandings and assumptions too. That
I'm not
the PM we start with
over with some clients, but I'm not opposed to that certainly. I think so, Dan. I think Dan Penrose, that I'm picking up on some body language that maybe that didn't fully resonate. That what I would suggest is like I said, be straightforward. Answer the question. Why does it cost so much to do this? Then answer the question, and then stop talking. Because so what we don't want to do is come across as like we're apologizing that it costs that much. And so yes, some clients don't know that when we're doing widgets in the scope, that this is what it takes for us to do a widget. So then in that situation, then we explain this is the work involved in doing a widget, and then stop talking. And like we need to express confidence, like we need to like convey confidence in our body language, in our words, that we know what we're talking about, and this is what it takes to do it. And we don't want to come across as sort of apologizing for it, or sort of feeling guilty about it, because they will pick up on that vibe and they'll run with it. So yes, it happens when clients don't know what's involved, but don't be swayed by that. Just straightforward explain this is what's involved and this is what it takes. And then they can decide that, okay, here's what it takes to do that work. Well, I don't want you to do that. Okay, then find a way to do what they want you to do. Obviously that meets regulations or whatever you need to do. But then find ways to downscope that comes in line with what they want to spend.
Have you seen willingness from clients to allow for like a management reserve to kind of deal with those contingencies?
Absolutely. I always ask I always encourage people to include management reserve as things that come up that is a pot of money that the main reason I see for having a management reserve is that lots of times contract amendments need to go to a higher level of an organization, whether that's to a city manager or a council or an operations VP or somebody else, that your PM doesn't have authorization to just sign off on amendments. And so having a management reserve gives wiggle room for you and the client to manage change without having to go back to a higher authority to get more money. And so that just makes life easier for you, makes life easier for them.
I think that that's a pretty common conversation for transportation projects. I don't know that that's as common in planning and maybe some of our other disciplines, but I think that coming up with some way of having that conversation, like we've talked about in other trainings around change management, is important at the scoping and budget estimating phase of the project with the client. And I kind of like the civil approach, with the I don't know if it's phase 98 or 99, but just sort of setting up that extra phase for out of scope work, and having a conversation with the client to say, we're just setting this up and this is where we'll capture things because we know it's likely to come up. And we'll talk to you before we, do things that land in that category.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say that I don't think there's anything wrong with having a conversation with the client at the beginning that, hey, in the event that something comes up along the way that's out of scope, or there's some kind of change in the project, what are your thoughts? Like, how do you and I want to handle this? And then I think I would encourage people to always have that conversation. That conversation may not result in a management reserve. It may not result in a code for additional services, but I would encourage you to always have that conversation. And I think most of the time you will find that clients will be open to creating some way of handling contingency. And then that's a lot easier to do in the beginning than to try to figure out what to do once change happens and you've never talked about it. So I would encourage people to have that conversation with their clients early. And those are a couple of examples of how to handle that. Management reserve is like just a pot of money that you telling the client, I'm not going to use this until you tell me it's okay. And then you move that money into phases you can charge against. Or additional services like Gene talked about, the civil and some other groups, that is like a T&M charge code that they ask you to do something that's not part of the lump sum scope, and say, yeah, sure, I'd be happy to do that for you, and you bill against it. When you do that, like I would, if I was working in civil, I would have conversations with the client to say, okay, we're going to set up this charge code for additional services. You just want to do that, and I'll just bill you when you ask me, and I'll tell you this is where I'm charging it, or do you want that to be capped at a certain dollar amount, or how do you want us to handle that? Because you don't want to get in situations where you're thinking, oh, well, I've got this additional services and they're clear that this is additional services, and so I'll just keep charging it this. So that at some point you might reach a dollar amount where they've wrote a check they can't cash, so to speak, proverbially. And so I still think it's incumbent upon us to help the client understand when they're spending money, because it's a lot harder for us to put the genie back in the bottle. Like if we break a budget on their end that we're not aware of, then it's hard for everybody. So even when we have yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to mention, we've actually hit the time period that we ask people to put on their calendars. So I know you're really into this topic in general and probably are not watching the clock. So I just thought I'd mention that it's 11:22.
Okay, cool. All right, I'll just leave it at that then on this. And then, so the last thing I was going to say here is that as you're building a budget, we talked last time about work breakdown structure and the scope, that sort of right sizing that work breakdown structure. And then as you're building the budget, you may find that, oh, I don't want this to be a subtask. I want this to be a task, or vice versa. And don't be shy that you can go ahead and massage your work breakdown structure at the time when you're developing the budget, if you think that makes sense, and then just make sure everything lines up again. So I know that happens sometimes, and that's perfectly normal. So really fast, myth busters. First myth, you can't change terms in a contract provided by a client. if I had a nickel for every time a client said, I can't change this because like, this is our normal template, then I could retire already. Then back to the idea, if you don't get what you don't ask for, that we're not going to sign contracts that put us SEJ in unnecessary risk. And the idea that we can't do this is just not true. Sometimes we have to push through some bureaucratic inertia, but that's something that we want to at least do and make a good faith effort at making that happen. It's okay to budget for the ideal, for the unicorn experience. We already talked about this, and Gene talked about this, is that this is not our reality. Hiccups happen along the way. We have on-the-job learning, and we need to budget for that. Client won't accept a conservative budget. Not the case. So like, the idea of like starting a little bit high and talking with the client and getting down to the right number, perfectly okay. Value pricing isn't fair. This is like in lump sum contracts that like this is the idea of like that we're pricing the work for the value it's providing, as opposed to pricing it solely based upon how long it's going to take us to do the work and how much are we paying the people to do it. So quickly, I'll give you like a really sort of hyperbolic classic example of this. Guy retires from a company as an IT person, like high-level IT person. They have this brand new fancy computer. Something's going wrong. It's not working right. They call him up and say, hey, this isn't working. Nobody knows what to do. Can you please come back and help us? He comes back and takes a look under the hood and ends up taking a screw that had fallen out and puts the screw back where it belongs and sends them a bill for $10,000. They come back and say, what the heck? Like you were here for like 5 minutes. Why the heck are you charging me $10,000? And can you please give us a breakdown, a more detailed breakdown invoice? And he sends back an invoice that says that, time spent to replace the screw, 15 minutes, $100. And knowing where to put the screw, 9,000, whatever that math is going to be, $850. So that's a sort of hyperbolic example of value pricing. So we're not always like just selling our hours when we're doing lump sum contracts. We're selling the value of the expertise that we're providing. The more niche a market gets, like CPT, the more that we're pricing value pricing as opposed to like selling hours. Last one, using a budget from a previous similar job is a good idea. So obviously there's some flaws in this. Inflation obviously is an easy one. Forgetting that we had some write-offs from a previous project, forgetting that there was amendments that we're not paying attention to. So when you grab something old, you may be borrowing someone else's mistakes. And last one.
Ooh, I like that one.
Client won't pay for project management and or admin support time. They may tell you that, but then we're just going to put the hours somewhere else. So we're going to budget it. We just may budget it in a place that's not called project management. But we're going to budget it. And then another one, you can't get paid for proposal time. And I'd say this is a myth, kind of. So it is verboten for us to transfer time, like on our labor transfer forms, it is verboten for us to transfer time in between P numbers and project numbers. But you could do something that say you are going to get a lump sum contract and you spend some time chasing the work or doing homework or doing background investigation before you got under contract, that you spend say $4,000 doing that. Now I'm negotiating the lump sum contract. Well, put that $4,000 in your number, and depending upon how that's going to go, is that you don't have to label it that. But if you want to get reimbursed for effort you put in on the proposal end, and you have a lump sum contract, then price that into the number. That would be a way of getting paid for proposal time. But the idea that we can move P number time from a P number to a job number is not okay.
And Scott, that's particularly for public projects. That's less of an issue for private projects.
Tammy will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think even if we're doing that on private jobs, then DOT finds that in our numbers.
Oh, okay. Got it.
We don't do that, period. But like it doesn't really matter. Like on a private job, that would be what Gene's talking about, is that like, like I said, put the 4,000 into your lump sum price and we're going to get the money. Now, so it's going to show up as that we made extra money on the job number, but we still, paid money on a P number. Well, it all works out in the wash. The money's still the same money at the very bottom line. We just don't move the time around anymore. It's okay to give a client cost plus fixed fee. I talked about this. If you have one who's asking for it, come see me and we'll make it go away. And so I said, never do this almost. There are rare exceptions. Bill Grimes. You raised your hand, sorry. You're muted.
Yeah, I hit the wrong button.
Okay, no problem. So takeaways, start high, don't negotiate just the budget. If you're going negotiating budget, then that comes along with negotiating the scope. Have backup for how you got to your number. Even if you're doing a lump sum, use the labor estimate template or something else. But I would encourage you to use the labor estimate template. Don't budget for unicorns. Value pricing is fair. Include time for admin, principals, QA/QC time, all those sort of nuisance things that you think, oh, I don't want to put this in here. And then lastly, use the tools that are available to you. And I'll stop for any last thoughts or questions people have for today. And then Pam, I think you were going to end out like normal sort of request for some feedback, and then the next one that we were going to do. So like you could take a look at these questions here. If somebody wants to speak up and speak to one of these, that'd be great. Otherwise, you can always send Pam and or I an email. Pam will send out some polling stuff, try to get some feedback from people as well. Next time we get together, we were going to do where does the $3 really go? This is like talking about our multiplier of 3 and what the basis for that, like what is where does that come from? That was going to be like in the July-August time frame, recognizing that there's a lot of vacations and PTO in the summer months. And we talked about potentially doing the labor estimate template instead of this. And so I think, Pam, you were going to send a poll and just ask people which one they would prefer as our next get together.
That's right. There'll be two things. One, the poll on which to do next, whether we should hold that one more to the fall when people aren't traveling, and then also the survey for follow-up, so we can do continual improvement on these presentations, these trainings.
Okay. And then, so Pam, anything I missed?
No, I don't think so. Just a reminder in case you weren't here right at the very beginning, this can be put on the training line of your timesheet.
All right, who wants to have the last word? No takers. Okay, everybody enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.